Hello, this is Matt Close. Let me be the first to welcome you to two webinars brought to you by the industry-leading partnership of Intelligent Buildings, LLC, and TEKsystems Global Services. Again, my name is Matt Close, and I'm the Vice President at Intelligent Buildings, and I will be your host today for our discussion. Intelligent Buildings is the leading solely focused smart building and managed services company, and TEKsystems Global Services is a leading IT services provider specializing in 8 core practice areas. TEKsystems and Intelligent Buildings formed our exclusive partnership to bring our expertise at scale to large real estate portfolios. Today, we're going to be reviewing the current state of technology in your buildings, what we can do to mitigate the risk inherent in today's environment. Before we get started and dive in, just a tiny bit of housekeeping. As we progress in our discussion today, please feel free to send us your questions in the QA feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll plan to address those questions at the end of today's webinar, and if for any reason we can't get to them all, we will absolutely follow up with you directly via email after we conclude today. So now let's get started and introduce our panelists. Welcome, Matt Ehrlich. Welcome, Matt. Yeah, Matt is the director of the Smart Building Services and IoT practice at TEKsystems Global Services. Very glad to have you here today, Matt. Next, we have Fred Gordy. Fred is the director of cybersecurity at Intelligent Buildings. And just as a kind of a bonus tip today, if you're at all involved in building systems, I'd recommend you give Fred a follow on LinkedIn. I know that I learn something from Fred every time I read one of his sections each week with all the insights that he shares. Fred, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for the kind words.
Awesome. Well, you keep the insights coming, Fred. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Tom Shercliffe. Tom is one of the principals and co-founders of Intelligent Buildings. Tom, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks. Looking forward to talking about this really important topic. Thank you, Matt.
Let's get started. So, we find ourselves today in an environment with a lot of technology and a lot of connected systems inside of our buildings. I'm going to come to you first. Based upon your experience and kind of expertise that you've garnered over the last 15, 20 years in this industry, how has this building landscape evolved to where we are today?
Well, yeah, I mean, probably the simplest takeaway from this slide here is that the cybersecurity we're talking about in these building control systems is not a so-called problem. If you can look there, starting in the 80s is where digital controls entered the scene. So this is really a 40-year problem of manufacturers making digital control systems and that have servers and protocols and networks and remote access. But for most 40 years, they've been designed, installed, and maintained by a group that didn't have any IT expertise. That's architects, engineers, contractors, subcontractors, facility property managers, asset managers. So it's really a 40-year problem that we're faced with here.
So Thomas, if it's a 40-year problem, why do we find ourselves so focused on cybersecurity for these building systems?
Yeah, that long ago, and even in recent history, it hadn't. Cybersecurity topic has been more focused on personal records and credit cards and these kind of things. And now the attention is turning to our millions of connected building systems and saying, wait a minute, an elevator, HVAC, lighting, parking, access control. These are really important systems for life safety and insurance and all kinds of other important issues. So it's really been a very quick awakening we're seeing.
Yeah, it's as we'll talk about in a couple of slides. It's kind of a rolling thunder, if you will. So Fred, picking up on the themes that Tom just spoke about, can you talk a little bit about some of those key vulnerabilities? Easy for me to say. Those key vulnerabilities inside of our buildings.
Sure. So during the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a movement to create open platforms. Open protocols were the vehicle for that. The goal was to give the end user flexibility to pick and choose the manufacturers and create blended systems. Open protocols allowed for disparate manufacturer platforms to communicate easily with each other. Also, with the of network capable DDC and this new form of networking, OT integrators were required to connect to the network. It was a key moment for OT and IT. At that time, um, OT and IT did not interact. If they had, the alignment could have significantly matured OT security, but because there has been no precedent for collaborating, aligning IT and OT wasn't a priority.
So if there weren't aligned, Fred, I mean, kind of that next one there that talks about open to the web, they kind of need to be today. Can you talk about kind of how we went kind of went from open systems to now open to the web and what that's doing?
Sure. So let's just start with an example here. A control network typically started out as an independent network. It wasn't connected to anything other than the devices of the same control system. Other than the facility management groups or vendors wanted to access it. The vendor would leave the OT network as is and add a second network interface, give the corporate users access. This opened the corporate network to all the vulnerabilities of the control system. The progression also wanted to give remote access to the control system. The vendor, without OT oversight, would add a DSL modem on an OT network and give remote access either by exposing the control system to the web directly or by installing a solution that they controlled, such as LogMeIn or TeamViewer. Now the control system is not only exposed, but there's a hole into the corporate network, potentially exposing sensitive information. Of course, none of this was done with malice. However, this is not unlike leaving the back door open to a fortified structure.
Yeah, so gone are the days of the air gap network.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So Tom, the last vulnerability that we had on the slide is really talking about primary vendor control. What does that mean in context of a building automation environment, and why does it make the systems, and I'll put them in air quotes, more vulnerable?
Yeah, well, this is really unique in real estate environments compared to traditional enterprise IT environments, because let's just take a portfolio, just to use round numbers, of 100 buildings. If I have 100 buildings, I might have 1,000 control systems: HVAC, elevator, parking, metering, lighting, and I could go on. And typical building systems, 1,000 control systems, and if I'm good, I may have 200 or 300 contractors. So when we're talking about the cybersecurity and integrity of control systems, we're talking about 200 to 400 different contractors, and it's just sort of mind-boggling to think about. Do you know, in the audience right now, whether all of those 1,000 control systems, passwords, current firmware? Do they have no more than one super user? Do they have, 20 authorized users because nobody was ever taken out? So these contractors are fragmented, because your elevator contractor doesn't usually manage your building automation system. They're all doing different things, frequent turnover. So you have big numbers, fragmentation, and turnover. So this is really the sort of the chaotic challenge here.
Okay. So you're making me nervous here, Tom, because if we think about what we hear in the news all the time, and there's hackers, and it sounds like there's a pretty big attack surface within the buildings. It ultimately leaves a lot of gaps to be exploited. We hear a lot about the hackers in the news and all these different trade publications thing. Fred, can you spend a few minutes kind of painting a picture of kind of who these hackers really are, and what are some of their motivations for creating the havoc that they do?
Sure. So first, let's start with the hacker types. The first one is what's called a script kiddie. These guys have some programming skills, but they're mostly a thrill seeker. A hacking group is basically a loose collection of these script kiddies. Hacktivism is a collection that act with political or social motivation. And the black hat, that's the more expert, the more mature coder, that generally they don't want to destroy anything and they don't seek publicity, but rather they want to develop attack avenues that can prove costly to governments and businesses. Organized criminals, we all know who they are, but they are actually in this realm as well. They function with a sophisticated structure guided by strict rules to ensure that their crimes go undetected by law enforcement. And then, of course, nation states. These hackers have massive computing power at their disposal, and they target critical infrastructure, military, utilities, protocols, political or financial sectors. And most of us remember the Sony hack. That was a nation state. Across all these groups, they have four motivations. One is financial gain. According to a Sprint report, this is what motivates the majority of them. Espionage, hackers that are motivated by espionage tend to focus on either political or manufacturing. Examples are stealing trade secrets or election hacking, and 9 out of 10 are state affiliated. Then there's this thing called FIG, which is fun, ideology, and grudge. Fun is usually not malicious, and these guys are just experimenting. Ideology, these attacks develop from a disagreement over politics or values between the target and the attacker. And then also grudge. This is where you have a disgruntled employee or a disgruntled vendor. And then other, this category encompasses all the additional miscellaneous motivations, such as employee error, system malfunction, which that is also a large majority of failures.
So what I take from that, Fred, is there's a lot of them. They have kind of different motivations. You know, like the hacktivism, we've all heard of anonymous and people that are trying to do, and I put it in air quotes, do good from hacking. You mentioned the Sony hack from a nation state. You know, so I'm a building operator. And you know, I'm hearing about all this, and I hear about IT and breaches of credit card information and everything. Why are the hackers shifting focus? And you know, I mean, you recently shared on LinkedIn, Fred, that the of hacking of OT systems is on the rise. I mean, up to like I think the number was like 400%. Kind of, you know, what has been the shifting focus and evolution to, you know, make us so lucky that in our environment of buildings and OT systems that we're starting to come into the crosshairs?
So I guess in one way you could say IT's been doing their job, because over the years IT has hardened the boundaries of the corporate network. So getting inside became harder and harder for the attackers. OT systems offer this path of least resistance, as we pointed out earlier, and OT systems became connected to the intranet and internet, and this elevated their exposure. Around 2008, OT systems moved into the hacker's radar, and by 2014, hacking began to accelerate and is now growing day by day, as you'll see later in the presentation.
Okay, so Tom, and I'll steal my own term here, with our OT systems kind of getting into the crosshairs, and we're starting to see a rise of it, and our customers are asking us to help them with strategies and things that we're doing. What's the nature of the attacks that are really kind of happening within the OT and building IoT environment, Tom?
Well, as you can see here, this one mentions ransomware, but really what we're talking about here is it's a behavior problem. I mean, ransomware is usually you and again, coincidentally, most cybersecurity incidents, up to 80%, are human behavior related. So this is one of those cases. Usually, it's not a technology failure; it's something that somebody did, and that's what you're seeing here.
I mean, you're talking to our customers and industry organizations all the time. Do you have some examples? You know, what does you can say ransomware, and you know, we hear it and we know it, but what does that look like? What does that feel like? What happens to a customer when that happens?
Well, first start with how it happens is one of the things that you don't see in the IT world is misuse of the application servers. In our world, in the OT world, the end user is actually sitting at the application server and doing things like checking their personal email, checking Facebook, and that kind of thing. So that's how it happens. And some of the results of that have been the majority of the OT hacks have been ransomware. But in one particular case, we had a customer that it took them 92 days to recover. And that was because they didn't have all the policies and procedures in place, because had they had a robust backup and disaster recovery plan, they possibly could have made the minimized that amount of impact.
Yeah, and I was recently involved in a conversation with a relatively sophisticated customer. And in the past year, they had 10 ransomware attacks on their portfolio. And in each case, they've had to, to your point, Fred, have that mitigation plan and being able to bring it back up. Tom, it is, and this is kind of a leading question because I have a graph, but is ransomware declining? Is it going away?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. It by itself is increasing significantly. What we want to focus on, here Fred talked about, the sort of emails and that attempt you into letting it in. We want to focus on how that occurs in facilities, in real estate, and so that's as important as what's happening in the general marketplace. But it really gets down to those 200 to 400 in our example contractors and what they're doing every day on the computers that are in the buildings.
Yeah, and Fred, the kind of phishing attacks that are being done in ransomware, are those, click here to win $1 million, or are they do they look a whole lot like what they should be clicking on?
I mean, the hacker is going to try to appeal to whatever it is that will get you to click, right? So facility guys, they're not getting the Amazon just wants to give you a $500 gift card. What they're getting is something that may look like it comes from a manufacturer. It may look like it comes from a customer. We had one where there's a thing called overtime air. So that's where the tenants can actually schedule their overtime air their own self. Well, they had a phishing email sent, and the email said, "Hey, I can't get this link to work for my overtime air. Can you check it?" And boom, they were got.
So they're not super sosophisticated, but they're more sophisticated to the specificity of what's going on in OT networks.
If I can say this real quick, is we want to say that we become desensitized to IT phishing campaigns to where they present a certain look and feel that is has nothing to do with OT. Well, the hacker is ever evolving, so they figured out, okay, well, these are primary campaigns using things like sign up for your benefits or whatever the case may be. So the hackers are taking and getting very specific about this is an OT centric kind of email that would appeal to the vendor or whoever that's controlling the system.
Awesome, thank you. Hey, just a little bit of a break in the middle here. I'm starting to get some awesome questions coming in that we'll get to at the end, but I want to remind everybody, if we touch on something that you want to double click on or dive into, please feel free to go to that Q&A at the bottom of the screen and send it in. We're getting some good ones, and I just want to make sure that's a robust discussion at the end. So picking back up, Matt, obviously is prevalent. We have that, but we also have a whole lot of really expensive things on our systems. In your leadership of the IoT and building services practice, you're on the front lines of this every day. Can you clarify the difference between, OT or operational technology and IoT?
Sure, absolutely, and thanks for making that clarification. The simple answer is there's a lot of things that are similar and other things that are different. And I think what's confusing and interesting is that as our world becomes more enabled by technology with more and more connected devices, these terms are going to be used a lot more broadly. So really our viewpoint is that IoT is the ability to exchange information or data across unique connected devices without any human interaction. The obvious ones that come to mind are really cool things like smartwatches and smart TVs, or people have connected homes with locks and smart garages, or automated energy systems like Nest within their individual home. I think that's what generally strikes a chord with people. From an operational technology perspective, though, that's really the enabling technology responsible for managing physical devices in the context of real estate that Tom and Fred were talking about. And so OT systems would, of course, be things like control systems, HVACs and lighting systems, elevators and escalators, as well as features like utilities and gas, electric, and water. What's really important to note is that the number of devices are increasing so rapidly that the risk posture is following suit. And while there are profound differences such as how things are installed or managed, provisioned, and secured, we are seeing these areas merge closely together, and that's why this partnership, between our two companies makes a lot of sense.
Got it. And so would it be safe to say that kind of that, across the bottom to the left of the slide there, the operational technology could almost be the internet of important and expensive things?
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. I think that's an appropriate commentary for sure.
Hey, Tom, just as there's a difference between the IoT and the OT as we're talking about here, also kind of a difference between the cultures and the outlooks of core OT and core IT. What are some of those key differences?
Well, I mean, and that really is a problem because we talked earlier about all those systems and all those contractors. Those are OT people and OT systems, but we also said they run on servers and protocols and networks and internet connectivity. So the reason that it hasn't been well addressed is because typical IT solutions can't come into the OT culture very easily. Not to mention, it's actually different technology. You can't use IT tools to see into your HVAC control system or your elevator system. So there's literally technology.
You just made a comment there that I want to make sure. So you say traditional IT tools can't come into the OT environment. Why is that?
Yeah, because it is quite literally different. Not to be too granular, but different protocols that aren't prevalent or common in the IT environment. So they speak different languages. So, it's amazing what you can do in an enterprise IT network to see and control all the devices and systems and so forth. In the OT environment, they speak a completely different language. And within that, each system speaks different languages. A lighting control protocol is probably not the same as your electrical submeter protocol. So that's back to this fragmentation. So you got to deal with the realities of the contractors, the budgets, the culture, and the technology that are active in these buildings. But you've also got to have some IT awareness about how you're going to resolve that. So again, I don't mean to also make a commercial, but you got to ask yourself, why is the leading building technology consulting and services company partnering with the leading IT services company? Because you've got to cover the spectrum and a plan in order to deal with it effectively.
Got it. Matt, Ehrlich, that second bullet point there, that procurement and management are different, and I think that kind of probably talks to kind of the life cycle and how those are going. I mean, you have a foot in both worlds every day. What are the differences and expectations of the refresh cycle between the IT environment and where it's going and the OT environment and where it's going?
Yeah, the differences are profound, and this is just one way that the cultural differences and the structural differences that Tom mentioned manifest. So, from an IT perspective, if you look at things, as many people on this phone know, IT is becoming far more agile. The expectations from the business on IT is to deliver new features and services quickly. Oftentimes, this comes in the form of sprints, which might be 2 weeks. Also, you see a lot of companies, if not the strong majority, adopting cloud. And so the need for things like hardware refreshes and typical patching and refreshes is dwindling. So I think it's right to assume that refresh cycles are going to be discussed in weeks, months, maybe days in the very near future. And that's a huge, huge culture shock comparing to bigger operational systems like elevators and HVAC. So I'm sure Tom or Fred can comment on that as well. But I think this is an exact example of things that corporations need to be thinking about, especially as you look at things like manufacturing and industrial, where these refresh cycles really overlap and can create true business value for organizations.
Yeah, so Matt, you said something there, and Tom, I'll throw this one your way. Matt, you talked about the fact that the IT environment is now operating in days, weeks, months, very, very short time horizons. And traditionally, IT's had a refresh cycle of hardware, kind of 3 to 5 years, and hardware is moving to the cloud, et cetera. Tom, is that the same timeline of refresh cycles on the OT side?
That's kind of funny to say because typically you think about system replacement, maybe not just controls, but in decades, not months or years. So things are in place a lot longer, but also back to your procurement bullet, the budgets, the contractors, the region territories, the silos of system types and how they get, it is so different and so broken up. It's really nothing at all like IT.
So, and again, if we think about the partnership here, and where one of the reasons we feel that it's something that's really helpful is bringing expertise of IT and bringing expertise of building systems and OT together, kind of help to address this issue in the marketplace. Matt, when you think about all these key distinctions between OT culture and IT culture and how that bleeds over into how they have to design, how IT, what's their priorities for design, and the networks and security postures and things, and OT and how they design. A person on this webinar thinking about, and how do I go about it? Can you talk about some of those differences in design and security approach?
Absolutely. And this, as I've learned more about this industry and had a lot more experience with clients, this slide is really the thesis and the big takeaway that those interested should be considering. So the foundational difference between the motivations of OT and IT is what causes the debate in the boardroom. And I think it's also the root cause between some of the cultural differences and motivations between the two groups. So just to explain a little bit more, core, IT is really focused on confidentiality. Policies and procedures are implemented to protect and manage data, meet regulatory constraints, and preserve those precious things such as intellectual property, personal health, financial information, trade secrets, etc. And those of you in IT, myself included, you learn this as a foundational aspect in any environment whatsoever. Any external exposure, by the way, on these items clearly create financial risk or brand issues, or shoot, we've even seen these things bring down companies with one bad breach. So it's really worth noting that from an IT leadership perspective, it's not that availability is unimportant. It's just that, something being inaccessible or down is not going to ever really trump confidentiality. So on the flip side, as Tom and Fred can attest to, OT leadership's motivating factor is really availability. So I just returned from a trip from Chicago this past week, and I was thinking to myself, man, can you imagine if the heating system shut down in February because the leadership team wanted to review some source code or do some sort of exercise? Of course not. It's freezing in Chicago. The heat going off would be chaos. And really availability is paramount, and the implications of that unavailability are vast. So IT really prioritizes confidentiality. OT really prioritizes availability. And as organizations merge, the connected devices are continuing to grow. I think this is a topic that we really need to have a lot more discussion around, and we're happy to facilitate that discussion.
Absolutely. And just for a second, and Fred, if you don't mind, why is availability, it sounds like a simple question, but I think there's so many implications to it. Why is availability so important to facilities people that own these OT systems?
Well, you got to realize that these systems, there's a lot of interconnected devices between that make up the system, and these things need to communicate in milliseconds in order for sequences of operations to happen correctly. Because some of these downstream effects may be things like blood storage. It may, if something happened and disabled, your temperatures may get hot. But basically, they have to communicate, and the people that work with the systems have to get to their systems in the event of an issue. You can't go through too many layers of having to log into the system in order to be able to get to it. So that it's always been built on convenience of access.
Got it. So it's both the availability of the data and being able to communicate in those milliseconds, but it's also just availability of access for all those.
Yes.
Kind of that primary vendor control world that Tom, you talked about earlier. It's making sure that it can get in, and traditionally confidentiality and integrity haven't been thought of in that. It's more of the access, and now we're having to merge those two worlds. And as business leaders in real estate and facilities management, it's up to all of us to figure out how do we merge these worlds, because we can't put our head in the sand and pretend it's not coming, because it absolutely is, and it's not just coming, it's here. With that in mind, Matt, if given this really interesting, I'll use that euphemistically, environment, attending on this webinar, and I have responsibility for mitigating risk in real estate portfolio. How do I get started?
Sure. Yeah, the first thing we recommend our clients is to perform a site inventory and a risk assessment. And our experience really shows that a lot of IT organizations are performing routine assessments, but generally their scope is somewhat limited, as hopefully we've discussed on this call today, the reason why, and they generally never include OT systems. So one of the, quick side note, one of the value props of our partnership here is that end-to-end view allows us to get that scope really correct when we do these assessments. One easy item that consistently comes up as a result of that exercise is usually system configuration for the vast contractor ecosystem and operational technology. And what's interesting there is it's not necessarily a difficult thing, but if you don't have the awareness, which comes from the assessment and the inventory, it's usually not something that you consider doing. So,
Hey Tom, is that something that's pretty key in all of this?
Yeah, and I just want to make a comment also that when we started doing these assessments as a consulting company, we made a mistake, frankly. We were doing very intense sort of site analysis and really just tearing apart a building stem to stern, and that was great for one building, but what about our proverbial 100 building portfolio? And what we realized was it wasn't sort of the depth of the details of the issues, it was the breadth of the problem. And so this is a good example of where these are sort of an inch deep and a mile wide. So we want to, as Matt said, we want inventory, we want a risk profile, and one of those first most important things, remember in our 1,000 control systems, is how have all those contractors basically set up the systems? Again, passwords, firmware, too many users, those kind of things.
awesome. Yeah, it's good point, Matt and Tom. Well, so after we go through that phase, we're really usually looking at policy review and then remediation as next steps. The reason this is important is generally this is where we capture quick wins and we set up good ROI conversation for future policy development and compliance, which allows organizations to stay protected. But it's also worth noting that wherever you sit in the organization, things like employee experience and retention policy and really just general capabilities that you want to invest in from a more IoT perspective, all of those things, you can't really do that unless you have this foundational standards and policies put in place. So in our next series, which we'll speak about the speedy evolution of the hacker, the last step that is on this, which is monitoring, is really, really important because of that risk exposure. But I just can't stress enough that it's really not possible to have good compliance monitoring, and it's not possible to do any remediation until you have awareness and insights, which we usually achieve through inventory and assessment. So if you are interested in understanding more about that, feel free to reach out to any of the panelists on this webinar, and we look forward to the next session with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And just so you all know, we're going to have all of our email addresses up at the end. So if you'd like to reach out to anybody on the panel, those will be there. And we've also, one of the easy questions of the questions we've got in, these slides will be made available after the session. So we are going to share them with everybody so you can have those. That kind of brings us to the end of I'll say the prepared comments that we have this morning, but we've gotten some great questions in, and I'm going to kind of, I've been kind of working in the background here trying to categorize them a little bit. And the first category, Fred, I'm going to kind of throw your way. And the overall heading is, kind of if you're thinking about the overall cybersecurity issues, and we've talked, Tom talked about at one point up to 10, 15 systems in any one building. Are the cybersecurity issues different between those different types of building systems, like HVAC, elevators, lighting, parking, etc.?
To go back to something that Tom said earlier, at the end of the day, it all boils down to the vendor. These systems, regardless of the type of system, I don't want to minimize the nuances, but at the end of the day, the vendor compliance it's basically non-existent. And so the first and foremost thing is understanding your vendor risk, and then also the assessing of the systems. They all need to be assessed. So I would say at this point, no.
So there's not vast differences there. There's a whole lot of commonality because of the ecosystem that's out there supporting it. Cool. So we've talked a lot about assessment. We've had a couple of different questions, and I think there might be a little bit of a confusion between Matt. You talked about it earlier, like an IT type assessment to an OT type assessment. So I would. The question is, and Tom, I'll throw this your way because you've been leading the organization, been doing a lot of it. I think the essence of the question is, how complex and what's the kind of investment in an assessment process.
Yeah, I think to that sounds like somebody is calling me out of my mea culpa that we were playing consultant in the beginning of this and really doing these comprehensive deep dives. And the answer is, as I alluded to earlier, is this whole conversation we realize will be designed for a portfolio view of your problem. So again, it's low cost, many sites, lots of quick, good information to give you a quick snapshot and what is the low hanging fruit and how you can take some simple steps. So again, we've lived this, Matt, and we've studied this for years, and it's meant to be a very doable, full portfolio, quick hit kind of thing, so you can get a snapshot of where you are.
Hey, Tom, because you brought up portfolio, I'm going to ask you one of the next questions that's come in, and I'm going to kind of anonymize it a tiny bit, so I'm not closing the. But the question kind of comes down to that they have a good sized commercial, they're a commercial type organization, and they have their own office buildings, but it's pretty varied. There's a lot of complexity in the portfolio, and some of it's corporate owned, some of it's managed by facilities, some of it might be leased. They got a few floors. How do you address the size and complexity of the portfolio in that process?
Yeah, I think that's addressed really in the beauty of the simplicity of what we're doing here, because it's essentially the same inventory, looking for certain rogue networks, systems, contractors, that kind of thing, no matter those situations. And we've done this in corporate real estate, REITs, military, government, college campuses. And so what we can do to the issue there is the process is no different, but what they might like is reporting segmentation by joint venture, by location, by region, by building, by contractor, those kind of things. So we can provide the information in lots of different ways, but the process doesn't change that much on site.
And
Okay.
Matt, can I comment on that real quick?
Please do. Please do.
Just from the IT perspective, this is a really interesting and really one of the reasons that we're investing heavily in this space is if you went to the board, let's say, and you wanted to do very, very heavily focused or heavy investments in IT security with large scope, you're going to need to prepare an ROI, essentially, a business case. I think what's unique about this space is hopefully we highlighted why real estate and operational technology specifically creates risk for the organization, but the simplicity and the actual remediation, we're not overhauling and fully modernizing systems here necessarily. It's a relatively simple byproduct. It could be some segmentation, it could be some network connectivity, it could be simply some upgrade and refresh of product. But when you look at the actual business case, it's a relatively small effort compared to some of the bigger things that produces a tremendous business value. And I think leadership is always looking for those situations. That's applied, by the way. It's one of the reasons that if you look at some of our joint customers, they're generally pretty large enterprises. The other piece I'll say is from a REIT perspective, if you're taking a real estate lens, I think this is a capability that's important to recognize as you resell or look to design your value prop to your end customers. If you're trying to attract tenants or retain tenants, this should be something that's top of mind for you because it's going to add that business value in a very simple way without jacking up the cost of the rent or whatever it might be, like other things would. So I just want to make that point.
By the way, Matt, I think that's a really key point, that last bit you brought up there, because this is I'll call it a latent or emerging problem in buildings. There's not a whole lot of organizations that have differentiated themselves by having a comprehensive approach. And so if you're able to do that, exactly to your point, it's another differentiation or value you're bringing to that property.
And Matt, one just quick point, it's definitely, we've had very specific conversations about this affecting valuation of a building, either high or low, depending on what they have or have not done. And then, but also as we've alluded to all through this webinar, nonetheless, valuation aside, there is an operational risk component here from life safety systems, environmental systems, just being able to simply occupy the building. So there's both this valuation conversation and the operational risk from whatever is occurring in the building.
Guys. So we, that kind of pulls all the different questions we got in kind of together. So thank you to the panel here. You guys have done an awesome job doing all those questions and answers. And kind of as we get, kind of start winding this down a little bit, I want to give you guys a second to be able to do some parting thoughts. So Fred, any last words of wisdom for us?
Sure. If you think about it, just like a building, a safety aware culture, building a safety aware culture, we got to create a cyber aware culture. Building a safety aware culture relies on the people getting involved and committing to the safety process and policies. Cyber awareness is no different. Regardless of all the technology used to harden the systems, your vendors and the people inside your organization have to commit to the cyber process and policies.
So Fred, I'm envisioning a sign on the wall that says X number of days since
Good example.
since an email. Yeah. Ehrlich, I know we'll be together again talking about the next phase of this in November. Any key thoughts to hold us over until then?
No, hopefully you learned something today. One piece that I think is just interesting to recognize, and hopefully you acknowledge this, is that unlike many other key initiatives, whether that's from a technology perspective, things like cloud or even the service desk or automation, or if there's business functions, maybe you're responsible for facilities as a whole. What's interesting about this segment is there is no one person responsible. This is absolutely an organizational topic that affects many layers. So just something to consider and have awareness around.
Tom, thank you for being here today. Your final thoughts?
Well, yeah, I, as the least technical guy on the panel, I can assure the audience that the way we've set up helping you with this is that you do not need to know cybersecurity or in-depth technology to get started. It's simply get an inventory, get a risk profile, know what's connected, not connected, and who did it. And that is very enlightening. So you don't need to understand the cybersecurity nuances here.
Awesome. Again, thank you to my compatriots here today. Like I said earlier, here is all of our email addresses. And we encourage you to reach out, ask questions, follow up. We'll be doing the same to any of the questions that we didn't get to. There was a couple that we didn't get to in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to follow up directly with you. Again, we'll be providing out copies of the slides for your use. So thank you again for the time. We'd really like you to join us for the part 2 of our session on November 15th. Mark your calendars. I want to give you a heads up. We're going to be sending out an invitation here shortly to this same group of folks. So please, if you got any value today, we'd love to have you back with us on November 15th, and we'll kind of pick up that discussion. And what we're going to be doing is kind of digging in a little bit to the frameworks for the best practices. So we talked a lot about the issue, and then we did start talking about what you can do about it. But we're going to talk about some of those frameworks for best practices in both building cybersecurity and vendor risk management. So please keep an eye out for that invitation, and you'll be getting that over the next few days. And we are here to make this industry better, and we're passionate about it. And please let us know however we can do that for you. Look forward to speaking with you all soon. And thank you very much for your time.